Shadows stretched long across the polished marble floor, and the murmur of routine transactions carried through the bank like a low hum before the storm. Customers shuffled papers, coins clinked faintly, and nothing about the morning hinted that it would end with outrage, applause, and the collapse of one man's authority. Yet hidden in the stillness was the seed of conflict, the kind of moment that would unravel dignity and pride before dozens of witnesses. No one watching suspected that an ordinary deposit would spark a confrontation so raw that the air itself seemed to harden, or that a figure almost dismissed as invisible would hold the key to reversing every sneer, every insult, every arrogant display of power. By the time the truth emerged, the entire room would learn that the line between humiliation and justice can be crossed in a heartbeat. Stay with this story, share your thoughts in the comments, tell me where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories where arrogance meets its reckoning. The lobby of the downtown bank gleamed with marble floors and glass counters, a place designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Alyssa stood just inside the doorway, clutching the small tin box she had decorated with stickers over the years, each one representing hours of chores, odd jobs, and tiny sacrifices. She had polished shoes for neighbors, sold lemonade on hot days, and even helped her grandmother with laundry to earn every dollar inside. For her, this was not just money. It was proof she could be responsible, proof she could dream of a future where her effort mattered. Her sneakers squeaked softly on the polished floor as she approached the counter, heart pounding in her chest with both nervousness and pride. Behind the counter sat Richard Collins, a middle-aged clerk with slicked back hair and a suit too tight around his shoulders. He had long since forgotten the value of kindness in customer service, carrying instead a permanent sneer that made even adults feel smaller. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw Alyssa. He didn't see a child stepping into a moment of growth. He saw someone beneath his notice, someone to belittle. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk as he measured her from head to toe with deliberate disdain. Alyssa lifted her chin, timid but determined, and placed the small box on the counter. "I'd like to deposit my savings, sir," she said softly, her voice quivering slightly but carrying the weight of pride behind it. Richard let out a sarcastic chuckle that drew the attention of a few nearby customers. Instead of lowering his voice, he raised it deliberately, ensuring every ear in the lobby caught his words. "This isn't a candy store," he scoffed loudly, tapping the counter with his pen. "Kids bringing coins here is pointless. Go home and play with dolls. We deal with real money here." A few heads turned, some customers glancing curiously, others smirking at the cruel performance unfolding. Alyssa's cheeks flushed a deep red as the words pierced her confidence. She had imagined a bank as a safe place, a place where her effort would be respected. Instead, the man she trusted to help her treated her as if she were a nuisance, a joke meant for public display. Her hands trembled, but she did not reach for the box. Inside, her pride warred with humiliation, whispering that if she turned and left now, she would carry this shame forever. Richard leaned closer, his smirk widening as he sensed her hesitation. He tapped the counter again, louder this time, each tap echoing like a drumbeat of contempt. "Do you have any idea where you are?" he asked with mock seriousness. "This is a bank, little girl, not your piggy bank. We don't have time for this nonsense." His tone dripped with arrogance, and the crowd around the lobby began to murmur. He leaned closer, squinting as if the pages themselves offended him. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he let his voice rise above the low hum of the lobby. "These crumpled bills," he said, his tone dripping with derision, "must have come from begging." The words sliced through Alyssa's fragile confidence like a blade. She felt every eye in the bank shift toward her, the weight of strangers' stares pressing down on her small frame. Her cheeks burned, and her chest tightened as shame coursed through her. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain how she had earned each dollar honestly, but Richard cut her off before she could speak. He snatched the book from the counter, flipped it open roughly, and then slammed it back down so hard the sound echoed across the marble lobby. The bang startled several customers, and the sudden silence that followed was broken only by Richard's mocking laughter. "Look at this," he continued. waving his hand dismissively at the savings book. Wrinkled bills, coins rattling around in a tin box, a child playing banker. This is pathetic. What did you expect? Applause. Alyssa's throat tightened, but her pride refused to let her lower her head. She clasped her hands together in front of her, nails digging into her palms to stop them from trembling. The humiliation stung deeply, yet inside her chest something stronger began to stir. Something that told her not to run away, not to let him erase the value of what she had worked so hard to save. A man in a suit standing a few feet away turned to watch, curiosity mixed with discomfort in his eyes. But he said nothing. A mother with her child shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Alyssa with pity, yet remained still. The silence of the bystanders fueled Richard's confidence. He leaned forward again, his sneer widening into a cruel grin. You should be out there in the street with a tin cup, little girl. That's where these scraps belong, not here in my bank. He stressed the words "my bank," as if he personally owned the building, the marble, the authority to decide who belonged and who did not. Alyssa's stomach knotted as his words echoed in her mind. For a moment, she fought the urge to retreat, to snatch her box back and escape the crushing gaze of the crowd. But something inside her resisted. She had faced doubt before, from classmates who laughed when she brought sandwiches instead of buying cafeteria food, from neighbors who underestimated her determination. Each time, she had endured, had kept going, had chosen pride over surrender. She lifted her chin just a fraction, her eyes glassy but defiant. "This is my money," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying a note of determination. Richard, hearing her soft protest, barked a laugh so sharp it echoed off the tall glass walls. He turned his head to the customers behind Alyssa, gesturing toward her as if she were some kind of exhibit. "Did you hear that?" he said loudly. "She actually thinks this pile of scraps means something." A ripple of chuckles rose from a few onlookers, while others looked away in discomfort, unwilling to be caught staring at the cruelty. Alyssa's heart pounded, but she stood rooted in place, her eyes fixed on Richard's face. She felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, yet she refused to let them fall. Each second stretched into eternity, the laughter and murmurs around her a reminder of the divide between dignity and humiliation. Richard slammed the savings book again, louder this time, making a woman at the far counter flinch. "You're wasting my time," he snapped, his voice hard now, stripped of pretense. "I have real customers to attend to, people with real money, not this circus act." He shoved the book back toward her, his hand brushing hers roughly, as though even touching the pages had soiled them. Alyssa swallowed hard, fighting the wave of shame and anger rising inside her. The humiliation cut deep, but it did not erase the truth she carried. This money was hers, earned with sweat and patience, and no amount of ridicule could change that. Richard leaned forward again, a predator sensing weakness, and with deliberate slowness pulled the crumpled bills out of her savings book. His lips twisted into a cruel smile as he held one up between two fingers, shaking it slightly like it was something dirty. "What is this even worth?" he sneered, his voice pitched just loud enough to reach the nearest customers. Without waiting for her answer, he let the bill slip from his fingers, fluttering down to the floor. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting to the fallen bill, but before she could react, Richard plucked out another, then another, and let them drop one by one, like scraps tossed to a beggar. Each piece of paper that hit the cold marble floor felt like a strike to her pride, each fluttering sound a reminder of how little he respected her. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her with mock amusement, as if daring her to bend down. "Go on," he taunted, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Pick it up. If it's really so precious, let's see how badly you want it." The laughter of a nearby customer cut through the silence, sharp and humiliating. It came from a well-dressed white woman in her 40s, holding a designer purse against her chest. She glanced at Alyssa with a smirk, her chuckle echoing Richard's cruelty. The sound made Alyssa's cheeks burn even hotter, her eyes stinging as she knelt slowly, her small fingers reaching for the first bill. Her knees touched the marble, the coldness of the floor biting into her skin as she gathered the fragile slips of paper, each one shaking in her hand as though it carried the weight of the humiliation she felt. Richard's grin widened as he watched, enjoying the sight of her bowing before him. He tapped the counter with his pen, each strike like applause for the cruel performance he had orchestrated. The woman's chuckle turned into a soft laugh, and another customer snorted, unable to resist the spectacle. Alyssa bit her lip hard, her pride screaming inside her not to cry, not to let the tears spill where they could see. She picked up the scattered bills with trembling hands, her small shoulders hunched, her dignity bruised but not broken. Every fiber of her being told her to scream, to run, but she forced herself to keep moving, forced herself to pick up each piece of her hard-earned savings. Around them, the lobby grew uncomfortably quiet again, the weight of the scene pressing on everyone present. Some customers shifted awkwardly, their eyes darting away, but no one spoke, no one intervened. Richard took their silence as validation, his confidence swelling as he leaned forward once more. "That's right," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "On your knees where you belong, picking up scraps. That's all this money ever was." Alyssa froze at the words, her small fists clenching around the fragile bills she had gathered. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. She wanted to shout that she had earned every single dollar, that none of it was scraps, that she had worked harder than Richard ever would know. But the words stuck in her throat, choked down by the heavy weight of shame. She stood slowly, her legs shaky, her chin trembling as she placed the bills back into the savings book. Her hands moved with care, as though protecting something sacred, even as the clerk across from her sneered. Richard leaned back in his chair and laughed again, louder this time, a cruel sound that bounced off the walls. "What a show," he said mockingly. "Maybe we should charge admission next time." The woman with the purse smirked again, shaking her head as though Alyssa were entertainment instead of a human being. Alyssa's eyes glistened, but still she held them high, refusing to let her tears fall where they could see. Inside her, humiliation churned with anger, creating something sharp and steady. She clutched the savings book tighter, as though drawing strength from the very pages Richard had tried to disgrace. He leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the counter, his smirk curling into something colder, sharper. He tilted his head slightly, looking her up and down again as if he were evaluating an object, not a child. Then, with a sneer loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, he asked, "Where are your parents? Or do they not even qualify for an account here?" His words cut like a blade, not only mocking her, but dragging her family into his cruelty. A few customers gasped softly, the venom of the remark leaving even them unsettled. Alyssa's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the edges of her book. She wanted to say that her father worked tirelessly, that her grandmother had raised her with love and strength, that her family had dignity no amount of money could buy. But the lump in her throat made speaking impossible, her voice trapped under the crushing weight of shame. Richard's smirk widened at her silence. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the sight of her small frame trembling under the weight of his words. "I thought so," he said with a mocking laugh. "Some families just don't belong in places like this. Maybe you should take your pennies back home where they belong." He reached for the phone on his desk, his fingers deliberately pressing the buttons one by one, making a show of it. His eyes never left Alyssa's face as he lifted the receiver to his ear, though no call truly connected. "Yes, this is Collins at the front desk," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the lobby. "We've got a situation here. A child loitering, disturbing business. I'll need someone from management to escort her out." The words echoed across the lobby, drawing even more stares from customers. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered among themselves, but still no one stepped forward. Richard mistook their silence as support, his smugness growing as he continued his cruel performance. Alyssa's chest rose and fell quickly, her heart racing as her humiliation deepened. The idea of being dragged out in front of everyone, treated like a trespasser in a place where she had come to deposit her savings, twisted like a knife in her stomach. She pressed her lips together tightly, fighting back tears, her eyes burning with the effort. The woman who had laughed earlier leaned toward another customer and whispered, her lips curling into a smirk as though this were all some amusing theater. A few customers frowned at her, but none confronted her openly. Alyssa stood frozen, every muscle in her body tense, as she listened to Richard continue his charade into the phone. "Yes, I said immediately," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "This child is disrupting the flow of business. I want her out now. Yes, escorted if necessary." He let the receiver drop back onto its cradle with a loud clatter, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight as he looked back at Alyssa. "You heard me," he said, tapping the counter with one finger. "Management will be here shortly. You can wait for them, or you can leave now and save yourself the trouble. Either way, you're done here." Alyssa's shoulders shook, her grip on the savings book so tight her fingers ached. For a fleeting moment, she thought of turning around, of walking out with what little dignity she had left, but another part of her screamed to stay, to stand her ground. She had not worked for years just to be laughed out of the place where her hard-earned money belonged. She kept her feet planted, her eyes locked on Richard, though her body trembled with the effort of holding herself together. Richard leaned back further, arms crossed, lips twisted in satisfaction as he regarded her defiance. "Still here?" he asked mockingly. "Fine. Wait until they come. Maybe then you'll understand that some people just don't fit in certain places." His words rang through the lobby, heavy with arrogance, but the unease in the room grew thicker. Customers exchanged glances, their whispers rising like a tide. An older man near the entrance muttered something under his breath, his jaw tight with disapproval. A young mother shook her head, pulling her child closer to her side, as if shielding them from the ugliness unfolding before their eyes. Alyssa heard the murmurs, felt the eyes still on her, but she refused to move. The words struck Alyssa like a physical blow, sharp and merciless, cutting deeper than any insult so far. They stripped away not only her effort, but her very sense of belonging, reducing her existence to something worthless in the eyes of a man who held power in this marble sanctuary. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a wave of shock running over the customers who had been silently watching. Some exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions torn between discomfort and disbelief at the raw venom in his tone. Yet among them, a cluster of younger customers chuckled, their laughter light and careless, as though cruelty had been turned into entertainment. The sound carried across the lobby, each laugh a hammer driving Alyssa further into the ground, amplifying her shame until it felt unbearable. Her body trembled violently, her small shoulders shaking as she clutched the savings box tight against her chest, holding it like a shield. Her eyes welled with tears that blurred her vision, the sting hot and unrelenting, yet she refused to let them spill. She had promised herself, quietly and fiercely, that she would not cry in front of this man, that she would not give him that victory. Richard's grin widened as the laughter reached his ears, feeding his arrogance. He turned slightly, looking around at the faces in the lobby, as if basking in applause. "See," he declared loudly, gesturing toward Alyssa with a sweeping motion. "Everyone knows it. This is no place for scraps, no place for beggars, no place for children who don't understand their place." His words thundered in the cavernous room, echoing off the glass and marble until they seemed to come from every direction at once. Alyssa's hands clenched tighter around her box, her nails biting into the worn surface of the tin. Inside, her money rattled softly, the sound barely audible above the cruel chorus, but to her it was the sound of years of determination, the sound of something no insult could erase. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling shakily, drawing on the memory of every odd job, every long afternoon under the sun, every proud smile from her grandmother when she handed her another dollar for the box. That memory anchored her, holding her steady as the storm of contempt raged around her. A man near the back of the lobby shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms and narrowing his eyes at Richard. A woman standing by the teller line bit her lip, her face tight with disapproval. But no one spoke, no one stepped forward, and their silence gave Richard license to continue. He slapped the counter with his palm, the sound sharp and commanding, drawing another round of startled glances. "Do you think you belong here?" he bellowed at Alyssa, his voice heavy with mockery. "Look around you. Do you see anyone else like you? Do you see anyone crawling in with a tin box and wrinkled scraps, pretending they're worth something?" Alyssa's lip trembled, but she stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on him through the blur of tears. Her small frame seemed fragile in the shadow of his towering arrogance, but within her chest, the flame of defiance burned brighter. She could feel it rising, mingling with her humiliation, transforming it into something sharper, something that refused to be crushed. A young man near the front snickered, elbowing his friend as if to draw attention to the spectacle. The friend laughed too, their voices low but cruel, the sound slicing through Alyssa's already wounded spirit. Each chuckle reminded her of every moment in her short life when she had been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked for circumstances she had no control over. The weight of those moments pressed heavily on her now, but instead of breaking her, it hardened her resolve. She pressed the box tighter to her chest, her arms wrapped around it, as though it contained not just her savings, but her very identity, her proof that she was not useless, not worthless, not the beggar Richard painted her to be. Her chest heaved with the effort of standing still, but she refused to back away, refused to step down from the spot where she had chosen to claim her right. Richard mistook her silence for defeat, his grin stretching wider. "That's right," he said loudly, his tone thick with satisfaction. "Quiet now, aren't you? Even you know you don't belong here. Even you know this is too much for you." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if the matter were settled, his arrogance filling the space like smoke. But beneath his triumph, the murmurs of disapproval grew louder. The accusation exploded into the air, heavy and cruel, sending a ripple of shock through the crowd. Alyssa's lips parted in horror, her voice catching in her throat as she struggled to breathe under the crushing weight of his words. Customers who had been silent gasped audibly this time, some shaking their heads, others whispering fiercely to one another. The young men who had laughed earlier suddenly looked uncertain, their grins faltering as Richard's words cut deeper into the territory of outright slander. Alyssa's small voice broke free at last, strained but determined. "It isn't stolen," she said quickly, her words rushing out, desperate to be heard. "I saved it for years. I cleaned porches, I carried groceries, I helped my grandmother with laundry. Every dollar is mine. I worked for it." Her words, though spoken with the urgency of truth, were met with only a harsh laugh from Richard. He raised a hand dismissively, waving her explanation away as though it were nothing more than noise. "Please," he sneered, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling before snapping his gaze back at her. "Do you expect me to believe that fairy tale? A little girl running around earning hundreds of dollars? Don't waste my time. You think anyone here believes you?" He turned slightly to the lobby, spreading his arms as if inviting confirmation, as if daring the crowd to contradict him. For a moment, silence pressed down, thick and suffocating. Alyssa's face crumpled with humiliation, her tears shimmering but still unshed, as she tried to speak again. "It's true, she began, but Richard's palm slapped the counter hard, the sharp crack silencing her instantly. His eyes blazed with mock authority as he cut her off. "Enough," he snapped. "I've heard enough of your lies. You can tell it to the police when they get here." The word police landed like a thunderclap in Alyssa's chest, her small frame jerking as fear coursed through her veins. She gripped the savings box tighter, her nails digging into its edges, her breathing uneven. Images of sirens, handcuffs, and cold accusations flashed in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought the entire lobby must hear it. Around her, murmurs rose into protests. An older woman in a dark coat whispered angrily to her husband, "She's a child, for God's sake. That's no way to talk to her." A man near the corner muttered, "This is going too far." Yet still no one intervened openly. Their words carried only in uneasy whispers. Richard, emboldened by the lack of direct challenge, leaned closer, his voice low and venomous now, meant only for Alyssa, though the crowd strained to hear. "You've been caught, little thief," he said, his smile cold and sharp. "And when the police come, you'll learn what happens to liars and beggars who try to fool people like me." Alyssa's tears finally broke loose, one slipping down her cheek despite her desperate attempt to hold it back. She shook her head fiercely, her voice breaking but urgent. "I didn't steal it. I worked. I did chores. I earned every single dollar. It's mine." Her words came out between sobs, fragile but true, each one carrying the weight of her pride and her desperation. Richard only chuckled, shaking his head slowly as though pitying her for the performance. "You're wasting your breath," he replied coldly. "No one believes you. Not me, not them." He gestured again toward the silent crowd, turning their uneasy stares into tools for his cruelty. The lobby had become a stage, and Richard was determined to paint Alyssa as the villain. Alyssa's legs wobbled beneath her, the fear of being dragged away by strangers gnawing at her resolve. But something deeper held her ground. She clutched the box tighter, her knuckles white, her small body trembling but refusing to move. The humiliation burned, the fear clawed, but her truth was stronger than his lies. "It's mine," she whispered again, her voice raw, her eyes locked on Richard with a quiet intensity that belied her trembling form. "Every dollar is mine." For the first time, a few voices in the crowd rose louder. The man in the corner spoke sharply, his voice carrying, "She's telling the truth." He slammed his palm against the counter with such force that the sound cracked like a gunshot across the marble lobby, making several customers flinch and one woman gasp. Alyssa jumped to the noise, her heart racing as Richard leaned forward, his face twisted with disdain. "Enough," he barked, his voice booming through the building, leaving no doubt that he wanted everyone present to hear. His eyes burned into her, sharp and merciless, stripping away any chance of dignity. "Get out," he growled, his words dripping with venom. "Get out of my bank before I have security drag you away like the little thief you are." The words cut through Alyssa's chest like steel, heavier even than the earlier accusations. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about her existence, her right to stand in that lobby, her right to be respected like any other person who walked through the tall glass doors. She felt her legs wobble, but she stayed frozen in place, too afraid to move and too stubborn to retreat. Her eyes blurred with tears, but her chin lifted a fraction, a silent protest in the face of his cruelty. Richard, noticing even that tiny act of defiance, sneered and waved his hand toward the far corner of the lobby where a uniformed security guard stood. The man had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, his posture tense, his eyes flicking between Alyssa and Richard. Now, with a sharp gesture of authority, Richard signaled him forward, snapping his fingers as if summoning a servant. The arrogance of the gesture sickened those who watched, but Richard seemed blind to the disgust simmering in the room. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, a smug smile spreading across his face as if he had already won, as if Alyssa were nothing more than a nuisance soon to be discarded. Alyssa's chest heaved as panic crashed over her. The image of being physically dragged out of the bank, her small body hauled through the lobby while strangers stared, ignited terror so strong it nearly buckled her knees. She pressed the box against her chest, as if holding onto it could keep her rooted in place, could shield her from the shame threatening to crush her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her young body trembling under the weight of fear. The security guard moved reluctantly, his step slow, his jaw clenched. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, his uniform crisp, but his eyes betrayed hesitation. He did not seem eager to carry out Richard's order, but the authority in the clerk's booming voice and the dozens of eyes watching forced his feet forward. The crowd fell silent again, the murmurs fading into tense anticipation. Some shifted uneasily, their expressions twisted with discomfort. The man in the dark suit muttered angrily under his breath, "This is wrong," while the elderly woman who had whispered earlier now shook her head openly, her lips pursed tightly in disapproval. Yet still, no one stepped between Richard and the girl. Alyssa's voice cracked as she tried once more to defend herself. "Please," she whispered hoarsely, her words breaking into sobs. "I didn't steal it. It's mine. I worked for it. Please don't do this." But Richard waved her off with a flick of his wrist, his smile widening as he relished the performance. "No more lies," he snapped, his tone mocking her desperation. "You've wasted enough of our time. "You don't belong here. Security, do your job." The words "do your job" rang with entitlement, dripping with the kind of authority that came not from real power, but from years of unchecked cruelty. Richard sat back as though he were a king issuing orders, confident the guard would carry out his will. Alyssa's sobs grew sharper, her voice breaking into the heavy silence as her words pleaded with the entire room. "It's mine. Please believe me. I didn't steal it." Her cries were soft but full of raw truth, slicing through the arrogant laughter that had dominated the scene moments before. The customers shifted again, the unease thickening. A man near the entrance spoke up in a low, firm tone. "She's telling the truth." You can hear it in her voice. Another nodded, muttering, "This isn't right." But Richard ignored them, his eyes fixed on Alyssa with triumphant contempt. The security guard reached the counter, standing just a few feet from Alyssa. His hands hovered at his belt, unsure, his eyes flickering to hers. What he saw there was not guilt, not defiance, but the desperate fear of a child fighting for her dignity. His chest tightened, but Richard's voice cut through again, sharp and commanding. "Well, don't just stand there," he barked. "Remove her." Alyssa stepped back instinctively, clutching her box tighter, her small frame shaking violently. She shook her head, whispering again, "Please, I didn't do anything wrong." The words trembled in the air, her desperation pressing against the heavy silence. The guard hesitated, his jaw clenched tighter, but Richard slammed his fist on the counter again, the sound cracking through the lobby. "Now," he roared, his smug smile betraying his eagerness to see her dragged away. Alyssa's face was streaked with tears, her chest heaving with ragged breaths, her hands trembling as she pressed the tin box tightly against her heart. The humiliation and fear had crushed her moments ago, but as she looked up at Richard's sneer, something inside her hardened. Her young shoulders straightened, her breathing slowed, and for the first time since she walked into the bank, her voice no longer wavered. She met Richard's gaze directly, her small eyes locked onto his cold, mocking stare. The words left her lips barely louder than a whisper, yet they carried with them the weight of something far stronger than fear. "You'll regret humiliating me." The silence that followed was immediate, sharp, and suffocating. The guard froze, his jaw tightening as he glanced between the child and the clerk, unsure what to do. The murmurs from the crowd stilled, their curiosity piquing at the sudden shift in Alyssa's tone. The sound of her whisper lingered in the marble hall like a promise, a thin but unbreakable thread of defiance that reached into the heart of every listener. Richard, for a moment, blinked, caught off guard by the steady fire in her words. But then his smirk cracked back into place, splitting into a loud, arrogant laugh that boomed across the lobby. He threw his head back, clapping his hand on the counter, as though he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Did you all hear that?" he bellowed, his laughter spilling into cruel echoes. "She thinks I'll regret this. A child with a box of scraps thinks she can threaten me." He laughed harder, the sound shrill and mocking, turning Alyssa's defiance into spectacle for the crowd. Some of the younger customers who had laughed earlier chuckled again, feeding on his arrogance, while others frowned, their unease deepening at the cruelty before them. Alyssa, however, did not flinch. Her eyes remained locked on Richard's, her lips pressed tightly together after her whisper. She refused to look away, refused to let his laughter crush the spark she had just ignited. Though her body still trembled, though her cheeks still glistened with tears, her gaze carried something no one in the room had expected from a child so small, the raw, unyielding strength of someone who refused to be erased. Richard leaned forward again, his laughter tapering into a mocking grin as he jabbed his finger at her. "You think your little words mean anything? You're nothing here. Nothing. I hold all the power, and you," he paused, sneering at her savings box, "you're just a scared little girl with coins and lies." He chuckled again, shaking his head as if brushing off a gnat. But the laughter this time did not land the way it had before. The crowd did not join in as eagerly, their faces shifting with unease. The defiance in Alyssa's whisper had stirred something in them, a discomfort with the imbalance before their eyes. An older man in a gray hat muttered, "She's braver than half the people here." A mother holding her child pulled him closer, her face pale as she watched Richard gloat. The guard, still standing by Alyssa, took a step back, his hesitation plain. He was no longer moving to grab her, no longer responding blindly to Richard's command. Something in her voice had stilled him, made him reconsider his role in this humiliation. Alyssa noticed the change, but she did not speak again. She let her silence do the work, her steady gaze burning into Richard as he tried to reassert control. His arrogance pushed him further, his voice rising again as he addressed the crowd. "What are you all staring at? She's nothing but a liar. She threatened me just now in my bank, and you think I'll tolerate that?" He turned to the guard again, his hand cutting sharply through the air. "Do your job already. Get her out of here before I call the police myself." But the guard did not move. His jaw clenched tighter, his arms hanging stiff at his sides as he stared at Alyssa. The guard's jaw tightened, but before he could move forward again, a new presence broke the tension. The doors at the far end of the lobby swung open with deliberate weight, and in walked a man whose stride carried authority in every step. His suit was sharp and immaculate, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, and his eyes were dark with purpose. His face bore the marks of experience, lines etched by years of work and responsibility, yet his posture was upright, commanding attention without him needing to say a word. Alyssa's eyes widened, her trembling lips parting in shock as relief coursed through her small frame. For a moment her voice failed, but the name formed silently on her lips: Dad. The crowd turned, their whispers falling silent as they sensed the shift, the power dynamic twisting in ways Richard could not yet comprehend. The man approached steadily, his expression unreadable, but his gaze locked on the clerk who sat smugly behind the counter. Richard glanced up, frowning at the interruption, irritated that his performance was being disrupted. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and barked, "What now? Can't you see I'm dealing with this situation?" His voice was loud and dismissive, dripping with the arrogance of someone who assumed authority belonged to him simply because no one had yet challenged it. But the man did not slow. He reached the counter, his eyes flicking briefly to Alyssa, softening with a flash of quiet reassurance before turning coldly back to Richard. Without speaking a word, he slipped a hand into his pocket and withdrew a sleek black card, one that gleamed under the fluorescent lights with embossed gold lettering. He placed it calmly on the counter, the sound of it clicking against the polished surface sharper than Richard's earlier slaps. The receptionist at the far desk, who had been watching nervously from the sidelines, gasped audibly and hurried forward, her face draining of color. She bent slightly at the sight of the card, her voice hushed but urgent. "Mr. Johnson," she breathed, her tone reverent and shaken. I didn't know you were here today." Richard blinked in confusion, his eyes darting to the card, then to the receptionist, then back to the man. "What is this?" he demanded with a scoff, trying to regain control. "Another trick? Some kind of—" But his words faltered when he caught the look on the receptionist's face. It was not just recognition. It was fear, the kind of fear reserved for those whose influence stretched far beyond the marble walls of this branch. Marcus Johnson, Alyssa's father, straightened, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the counter as he finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but each syllable carried authority that reverberated in the silence. "This savings," he said, gesturing to the box, still clutched in Alyssa's trembling hands, "belongs to my daughter. She has every right to deposit it here. Every dollar was earned honestly, and she deserves respect for her effort, not humiliation." His words cut through the heavy air with precision, striking not only Richard, but everyone in the lobby. The receptionist bowed her head, shame flooding her features as she murmured apologies. The customers shifted, their whispers now loud with agreement, some nodding, some muttering, finally, as the truth began to reshape the scene. Richard, however, flushed red, his arrogance clashing violently with the reality of what stood before him. "And who exactly are you?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the certainty it carried moments ago. "Do you think you can just waltz in here and tell me how to do my job?" Marcus leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. He tapped the VIP card with one finger, the small gesture louder than any shout. "I don't need to think," he said evenly. "I am one of the bank's largest investors. My family has had accounts here for decades, and this card is proof that my presence alone carries more weight in this building than yours ever will. You have mocked my daughter, you have accused her without reason, and now you will answer for it." The crowd gasped again, the revelation striking them with force. The man Richard had treated as a nuisance, the child he had called a beggar and thief, was not just anyone. She was the daughter of a man whose influence could shake the very foundation of the bank. Alyssa's chest swelled with relief and pride, her tears still clinging to her cheeks, but her spirit lifting as she leaned closer to her father, clutching her box like a trophy instead of a burden. Richard's smugness cracked, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the card, his composure unraveling. He stammered, trying to regain footing. "Well, I didn't know," he began, but Marcus cut him off with a sharp look that silenced him instantly. "You didn't care to know," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "You saw a child and chose cruelty. You saw her skin and assumed she did not belong." He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Richard, his tone quiet but firm, every word deliberate, as though carved into stone. "This savings belongs to my daughter," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the lobby with undeniable authority. "And she has every right to deposit every single dollar she earned. Her work, her determination, her pride in saving these bills, none of it gives you the right to mock or humiliate her." The weight of his words pressed against every wall, each syllable cutting through the arrogance that had dominated the room. Alyssa's eyes lifted to her father, the tears still fresh but now mixed with pride. For the first time since she entered the bank, she felt seen, her truth no longer buried beneath laughter and scorn. The crowd shifted, their murmurs swelling into clear voices. A man in the corner, who had earlier muttered his disapproval under his breath, now spoke louder, his voice sharp with anger. He treated that little girl like trash. We all saw it. A woman clutching her purse nodded fiercely, adding, "That wasn't just rudeness. That was racism, plain and simple." Another customer, a younger man, stepped forward slightly and pointed toward Richard. He accused her of stealing. He humiliated her. That's not banking. That's hate. Their voices filled the lobby, rising above the low hum that had lingered before. Richard's eyes darted nervously from one face to another, his arrogance faltering as the crowd turned openly against him. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Marcus's calm, unwavering presence silenced him before he could speak. Marcus shifted his gaze from Richard to the crowd, his voice still steady, still calm, yet now infused with something heavier, something that demanded accountability. "You all saw what happened," he said. "You saw my daughter mocked, accused, and treated as if she were less than human because of the color of her skin and the size of her savings. Tell me, is that the kind of bank you trust with your money?" His words landed like thunder, and the murmurs swelled into louder outbursts. A man near the door shook his head angrily and muttered, "I'll take my money somewhere else if this is how customers get treated." A woman with silver hair raised her voice sharply, her face red with anger. "I've banked here for years. I won't stay another day if this clerk is allowed to keep his job." Richard flushed deep crimson, his composure unraveling as his grip on the room slipped completely. He tried again to assert himself, leaning forward with a shaky voice. "This is being blown out of proportion. I was following procedure." But he was cut off by another customer, a mother holding her child tightly. "Procedure," she spat, her voice trembling with outrage. "Procedure doesn't include making a little girl kneel to pick up her money. Procedure doesn't include calling her a thief without proof. That wasn't procedure. That was cruelty." The guard, who had hesitated earlier, now stepped back fully, his eyes hard with quiet disapproval as he crossed his arms. It was clear he would not touch Alyssa. Not now, not ever again after hearing the truth laid bare. Richard's voice faltered, his mouth opening and closing without sound as the judgment of the room crashed down on him. Marcus remained calm, his presence towering without needing to shout. He turned back to Richard, his eyes steady, his words sharp as steel. "You should be ashamed," he he said. "Not because you failed at your job, but because you failed as a human being. You looked at a child and decided she was beneath you. You saw her race, her age, her clothes, and you chose to humiliate her. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the restless murmurs of the customers who had become witnesses to injustice. Richard sat frozen, his body tense, his pride shattered. Marcus lifted the VIP card again, his voice calm but final. "This bank will hear from me, and I promise you, this moment will not be forgotten." Alyssa, still holding her box tightly, looked up at her father with wide eyes. The customers continued murmuring loudly, no longer whispers, but voices filled with anger and condemnation, pointing at Richard, recalling his insults, his accusations, his cruelty. Each word from them was another blow to the false wall of power he had built around himself. Richard's chest tightened as he realized what he had done. This was not just a child he had mocked. This was the daughter of one of the bank's most influential clients, a man whose investments and reputation could cripple careers and topple the very stability of the branch. For the first time, Richard's voice trembled as he tried to recover, his words stumbling out. I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes darting between Marcus and Alyssa, his face flushing pale then red. "If I had known who she was," but the crowd erupted at his words, a wave of outrage crashing against his pathetic defense. "If you had known who she was," a man near the front barked, his face twisted with anger. "So it's fine to treat her like garbage as long as she isn't important? That's your excuse." A woman with gray hair stepped forward, her voice sharp and furious. "She's a child, a customer. She didn't need to be someone's daughter to deserve respect. You've exposed yourself for what you are." Their anger filled the lobby, drowning Richard's words, silencing him before he could dig himself deeper. He slumped slightly, sweat beginning to form on his brow, his earlier smug confidence shattered. Marcus remained composed, his presence towering, his calm voice a striking contrast to Richard's panic. He didn't raise his tone, but his words cut sharper than any shout. "You've revealed the truth of who you are," Marcus said evenly. "You believed your cruelty made you powerful. But power without respect is nothing but weakness disguised as authority. And now everyone sees it." Richard's mouth opened again, but before he could respond, hurried footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The double doors to the manager's office burst open, and the branch manager, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a disheveled tie, rushed out with panic written all over his face. His eyes swept across the lobby, taking in the scene, the cluster of customers glaring, the guard standing stiff with hesitation, the receptionist pale with shame, Alyssa clinging to her tin box with tear-streaked cheeks, and Marcus, calm but commanding, standing tall at the counter. Finally, his eyes fell on Richard, who sat pale and trembling, his composure completely gone. "What on earth is happening here?" the manager demanded, his voice shaking not with anger alone, but with fear. He had already caught fragments of the murmurs through the office walls, but the sight before him confirmed the severity of the disaster. A chorus of voices answered at once, customers pointing, shouting accusations, their frustration spilling into the air all at once. "He made her pick up her money from the floor," one cried. "He accused her of stealing," another added. "He threatened to call the police on a child." The sound of their voices grew into a storm, a unified condemnation that rattled the manager's composure further. His face drained of color as he realized the scope of the scandal, his career flashing before his eyes. He hurried forward, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to calm the crowd, his words tumbling out in rushed tones. "Please, everyone, calm down. This is clearly a misunderstanding. I assure you the bank does not condone," but he was cut off by Marcus's firm, resonant voice. "This was no misunderstanding," Marcus said, his words ringing clear. "It was cruelty, plain and deliberate, and it happened under your watch." The manager faltered, his voice lost as Marcus's words struck home. The murmurs of the crowd rose again, customers nodding, some crossing their arms, others glaring at both Richard and the manager. The pressure in the room was suffocating, and the manager's panic deepened. He turned sharply to Richard, his eyes blazing with fury. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice trembling as he gestured wildly toward Alyssa. "Do you have any idea who you've insulted?" Richard stammered again, his words tumbling over one another. I didn't know. She came in with a box, I thought." But the manager cut him off sharply, his words a whip. "You thought? You humiliated a child in front of a lobby full of customers. You accused her of theft. You threatened her. And now you've humiliated this entire branch." His voice cracked with fury and fear, his body trembling as he realized how quickly this disaster could spiral. Customers murmured louder, some even pulling out their phones to record, their cameras glinting as they captured the fallout. The manager paled further, his hands trembling as he realized the evidence of this humiliation would not remain contained within the walls of the bank. The snapping sound of a phone camera shattered the air as a young woman near the front raised her cell high, recording every detail of the unfolding scene. Her voice carried clear and sharp across the marble floor, trembling with indignation but steady with determination. "The world needs to see this," she said, her tone both defiant and condemning. "They need to see how this bank treats a little girl." Several others followed, pulling out their phones, their screens glowing like tiny mirrors of justice, capturing Richard's shame, Marcus's composure, Alyssa's courage, and the crowd's fury. The manager's face blanched further at the sight, panic flashing in his eyes as he realized the scandal would not remain confined within these walls. Richard flinched at the growing forest of cameras, his eyes darting desperately for escape, his hands twitching on the counter as though trying to clutch the remnants of power that had slipped through his fingers. But the voices of the crowd drowned him, surging louder, sharper. A man near the corner shouted, his voice thick with anger, "You made her kneel to pick up her money. A child. What kind of monster does that?" Another cried, "Accusing her of stealing because she's black? That's all this was, racism, plain and simple." The truth hit the air like thunder, raw and undeniable, and the crowd erupted in boos. The sound rose in waves, bouncing off the glass walls and marble floors, each note of contempt hammering down on Richard, who shrank further under their wrath. The manager held up his hands, desperate, his voice cracking as he pleaded for calm. "Please, everyone, please, let us handle this internally." But his words were swallowed by the fury in the lobby. Then, a single voice cut through the storm, trembling with age but sharp with conviction. An elderly woman with snow-white hair, who had been sitting quietly near the teller line, rose to her feet. Her back was straight despite her years, her eyes blazing as she pointed a trembling finger toward the counter. Her voice carried the weight of decades of loyalty and the authority of someone who had weathered many storms. "I've banked here for 30 years, she declared, her voice steady, every syllable laced with righteous fury. "But if this bank tolerates this employee, I'll withdraw every cent I've ever trusted you with." The words struck like lightning. The room fell silent for a breath, the magnitude of her statement echoing across the space. Then, like sparks catching fire, others followed. "Me too," a man shouted from the back, his tone firm and resolute. "I won't leave my money here if this is how you treat people." Another voice, a young woman holding her child, cried, "We'll close our accounts today. No family should feel unsafe bringing their children here." The boos resumed, louder this time, but now laced with vows, promises of action that could not be ignored. The bank was no longer simply facing embarrassment. It was facing revolt. The manager's forehead glistened with sweat as the reality closed in. He wrung his hands together, his heart racing, his mind spinning with the image of accounts draining, investments lost, the reputation of the branch collapsing in a matter of minutes. His eyes flicked desperately between Marcus and the furious crowd, but there was no escape, no words that could silence what had already grown into a firestorm. Richard opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but the sound of boos drowned his trembling voice. "You're finished," someone shouted. "We don't want you here." Another voice added, "Get him out, now." The security guard who had hesitated earlier now took a step closer to Richard, his expression grim. His authority, once tied to Richard's commands, now bent toward the will of the crowd and the truth Marcus had unveiled. The phones kept recording, the cameras flashing, each angle a testament to Richard's downfall. Alyssa stood close to her father, her face still damp with tears, but her eyes widened with awe as she watched the crowd turn against the man who had tried to crush her. Others had followed, voices rising, vowing to close their accounts, their anger rising not just for Alyssa, but for every child, every customer who might one day be treated with the same disdain. Richard sat hunched behind the counter, pale and sweating, his earlier sneer gone, replaced by the desperate twitch of a man cornered. The manager stood a few feet away, his face flushed with panic, his tie hanging crooked, his hands raised as if trying to calm a storm that refused to be quieted. He looked from customer to customer, hearing threats of lost accounts, his career unraveling with every promise shouted from the crowd. His attempts at appeasement had already failed, his words drowned by the noise of a public that had seen too much to be silenced. Into this storm, Marcus's voice cut clear and strong. He didn't raise his tone to match the crowd. He didn't need to. His words carried because they were deliberate, calm, and undeniable. Standing tall beside Alyssa, who clutched her tin box tightly against her chest, Marcus looked directly at the manager and spoke with the weight of a man who knew both his power and his responsibility. "I want justice carried out right here, right now." The words struck like thunder. The boos ceased for a heartbeat, the crowd leaning in, waiting, watching, hungry for the next act in this unfolding drama. The manager froze, his chest tightening as every eye in the room turned to him. His instinct was to stall, to beg for more time, to sweep this disaster under the rug before it destroyed him completely. But there was no rug large enough to hide this. The cameras were recording. The customers were furious. And Marcus Johnson stood before him, his presence unshakable, his demand clear. Justice had to be immediate. The manager's lips parted, his voice faltering. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you, this will be investigated thoroughly. If you'll allow us some time." Marcus's gaze cut through him, steady and sharp. "No. Time is what allows men like him to keep their jobs. Time is what lets cruelty be forgotten. My daughter was humiliated here, accused, mocked, forced to kneel, and called a thief in front of everyone. You will not bury this under paperwork. You will act now." The silence that followed his words pressed down on the manager's shoulders, heavier than any weight he had ever carried. He looked at the crowd, their faces hard with expectation, their eyes demanding the same justice Marcus had spoken aloud. He looked at Richard, who sat trembling, his hands twitching against the desk, his mouth opening to protest, but no words forming. And he realized there was no path left but one. His heart pounded, his palms slick with sweat, as he turned toward the security guard. The man in uniform stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his hands hovering near his belt, his eyes narrowed at Richard with quiet disgust. The manager swallowed hard, his voice hoarse as he forced the words out. "Remove him," he ordered, each syllable cracking under the strain of fear and inevitability. For a heartbeat, silence reigned again as the weight of the command settled on the room. Then the guard moved, his steps deliberate, his expression cold with resolve. The crowd erupted, some gasping in shock, others cheering, their voices blending into a storm of approval. Richard's head jerked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What? No, you can't do this to me." His voice cracked, shrill and desperate, nothing like the booming arrogance it had carried minutes before. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over his chair in the process, his hands flailing as if reaching for invisible strings of authority that had already been cut. "I was only doing my job," he screamed, his voice breaking, his face blotched red and pale at once. "I was following procedure. You can't let them." But his pleas were drowned out by the crowd's voices. "Get him out. Justice now. He doesn't belong here." The security guard reached him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, his grip unyielding. Richard twisted, trying to pull free, but the guard's strength overpowered him easily. His protests rose higher, more desperate. "You'll regret this. I'll sue. I've given years to this bank." But the boos swallowed his threats, the sound so loud it rattled the glass doors and echoed off the marble floor. The receptionist stood off to the side, her face pale, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth, too horrified to look. Alyssa watched, her small body pressed close to her father, her eyes wide as she witnessed the fall of the man who had tried to crush her. He kicked against the polished floor, his voice breaking into frantic shouts. "I was only following procedure," he screamed, the words cracking, desperate, shrill. His face turned blotchy red as veins stood out along his neck. "I did nothing wrong. This isn't fair." The words rang hollow, drowned beneath the rising voices of customers who had seen every insult, every act of contempt he had delivered to Alyssa. No one believed his excuse, no one accepted his plea. His voice, which had once filled the room with confidence, now carried only panic and futility. The guard dragged him forward, his large hands firm against Richard's shoulders, his face expressionless as he forced the clerk toward the glass doors. Richard twisted violently, his shoes squealing against the marble as he struggled. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his voice shrill, his words splintering into incoherence. "I'll fight this. I'll sue all of you. You'll regret this." But his protests only ignited the crowd's fury. A man in a suit shouted back, his voice carrying over the noise. "You regret humiliating that little girl? No. Now you regret being caught." His words were met with cheers, the lobby bursting with approval. The elderly woman who had earlier vowed to withdraw her savings stood straighter, her eyes blazing with satisfaction as she raised her voice again. "This is what justice looks like," she cried, her words striking like a gavel. The crowd erupted, their boos transforming into clapping, the sound swelling like a wave. Hands slapped together in rhythm, filling the space with a thunderous roar of applause. Some customers whistled sharply, the piercing notes mocking the man who once believed he had total control. Others shouted words that twisted the knife of his humiliation further. "Out with him. Shame on you. Don't come back." Richard's eyes darted wildly as the noise grew, his arrogance stripped away completely, his composure shattered beyond repair. He tugged against the guard's grip, his movements frantic, but the man in uniform held firm, his steps steady as he marched Richard toward the exit. The polished floor reflected Richard's distorted figure as he stumbled, his tie swinging loose, his once crisp shirt now rumpled and damp. Each step forward was another nail in the coffin of his pride, another reminder that the power he had abused was gone forever. Alyssa clung to her father's side, her small body trembling not with fear this time, but with the overwhelming surge of justice unfolding before her eyes. She watched as the man who had forced her to kneel, who had called her a thief, who had tried to break her spirit, was dragged in shame before the very people he had once tried to impress. Her heart pounded, her cheeks still damp with tears, but a new strength rose inside her. She felt taller, braver, her father's presence beside her and the crowd's support filling her with pride. Marcus stood with quiet authority, his eyes never leaving Richard as he was pulled across the lobby. His hand rested on Alyssa's shoulder, steady and reassuring, his presence radiating strength without a single word. He did not cheer, he did not clap, but his silence spoke louder than any sound, the calm of a man who had demanded justice and now watched it carried out. Richard's shouts grew more frantic as the doors neared, his voice shrill and desperate. "This isn't over," he wailed, his feet skidding against the floor. "You'll all regret this. I'm innocent. I followed procedure. I was doing my job." But his words dissolved into the roar of applause and whistles, lost beneath the sound of 100 hands slapping together and voices shouting their contempt. Customers laughed openly now, their mocking whistles sharp and unrelenting, their applause a celebration of his downfall. The glass doors loomed ahead, their reflection casting Richard's distorted face back at him, pale and twisted with humiliation. The guard shoved them open with one hand, dragging Richard through as the noise from the lobby poured into the street outside. For one last desperate moment, Richard twisted his head back, his eyes wide, his voice cracking as he cried, "Please, listen to me." I didn't, but the doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his words, silencing his protests, leaving only the echo of applause ringing in the lobby. The customers continued clapping, their faces lit with satisfaction, their voices mingling into one clear message. Justice had been served. Alyssa exhaled a shaky breath, her grip on her box loosening slightly as the tension drained from her small frame. She looked up at her father, her eyes wide, her lips trembling, and whispered, "He's gone." Marcus bent his head slightly, his voice low but firm, a steady anchor amid the storm. The applause was still fading when the glass doors slammed shut behind Richard, leaving only the echo of his shrill protests bouncing off the walls before being swallowed by silence. The security guard returned, his expression firm and resolute, no longer under the thumb of a cruel clerk, but now standing with the customers whose anger had been vindicated. Richard was gone, humiliated in front of everyone, his authority shattered beyond repair. But though the crowd felt justice in seeing him dragged out, their eyes remained fixed on Alyssa, the child who had stood trembling yet unyielding, who had absorbed insult after insult without surrendering her truth. She clutched her tin box tightly, her cheeks still damp, her small body tense, as if afraid the moment of peace might shatter again. Marcus stood tall at her side, calm and composed, his presence unshakable. Slowly, he bent his head toward her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. His deep voice carried through the quieted lobby, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and filled with a weight that reached every ear. "You stayed strong," he said, his gaze steady on her tear-streaked face. "And today you showed them the truth." Alyssa's lip trembled as she looked up at her father, her small hands gripping the box tighter. Her tears threatened to rise again, but this time they were not from humiliation or fear. They were from the overwhelming relief of being seen, being defended, and knowing she had endured without breaking. She nodded faintly, pressing her cheek against his hand, and for the first time since entering the bank, she allowed herself to breathe freely. The crowd, touched by the scene, softened too. Their applause had been thunderous moments ago, filled with anger and triumph, but now the silence was heavy with respect. Some nodded quietly, others murmured words of approval, their eyes no longer filled with outrage, but with something gentler, admiration for the courage of a child and the steadfastness of a father. The branch manager stood frozen in the middle of it all, his face pale, his shirt clinging to him with sweat, his tie askew. He had tried to contain the storm and failed, had watched helplessly as Richard destroyed the bank's reputation in a matter of minutes. Now, with Marcus's words still lingering, he realized there was only one thing left he could do to salvage even the smallest shred of dignity for the institution he represented. Slowly, with trembling steps, he approached Alyssa and Marcus. The murmurs hushed as the crowd watched, their eyes narrowing with expectation. Every camera was still raised, every phone still recording, capturing his every move. He stopped before them, bowed deeply, and when he lifted his head, his voice shook with sincerity. "Young lady," he said, his words directed to Alyssa, "I cannot undo what has been done to you. I cannot take back the pain and humiliation you endured under the roof of this bank. But I can tell you, in front of everyone here, that we are sorry. We failed you. I failed you. And it will not happen again." His voice cracked as he looked around the lobby, addressing the witnesses as much as Alyssa. "That man, Richard, is finished here. He will never work in this bank again. And I promise you, every member of this staff will undergo training, every policy will be reviewed, and no customer will ever be treated with such cruelty again. That is my word." The words reverberated through the lobby, striking both the crowd and Alyssa herself. She stared at him, wide-eyed, her young mind trying to absorb the weight of what it meant, that the man who had mocked her was gone, that the bank itself was forced to change because she had refused to leave, because she had stood her ground. The crowd erupted once more, but this time their cheers were not mocking. They were approving, supportive, filled with relief that something good was born out of cruelty. Many applauded again, not for the manager, but for Alyssa, for her father, for the justice that had been carved into that marble floor. Some shouted words of encouragement. "Stay strong, little one. You showed them. That's real courage." Alyssa's heart swelled with a mixture of emotions too big for her small body to hold. Relief, pride, exhaustion, and above all, the quiet knowledge that she had not been erased, not been silenced. She looked again at her father, whose steady presence grounded her, whose calm authority had turned the tide of the entire room. He smiled faintly at her, his eyes soft now, no longer sharp with command but warm with pride. He bent low, his voice just for her. "Remember this, Alyssa. People will try to tear you down because of who you are, because of what they think you are worth. But worth is not theirs to decide. You prove today that no one has the right to strip your dignity away. Hold on to that always." She nodded again, her throat too tight to speak, her small hands clinging to the box as though it were more than money. It was proof, a symbol of her resilience. The customers began to drift out slowly, their voices still buzzing, their minds filled with the story they would tell others, the lesson they had just witnessed. The elderly woman lingered for a moment, walking up to Alyssa and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Her voice was softer now, almost kind. "Don't forget, child, you made us all braver today." With that, she left, her step steady, her head high. The manager remained standing awkwardly, his bow still etched into his posture, his words heavy with the burden of accountability. He knew this day would follow him, that the recordings would spread, that his promises would be tested. But for now, he had done what he could. The security guard, once a silent witness, gave Alyssa a small nod of respect before stepping back to his post, his eyes lowered, perhaps in quiet shame for not acting sooner, perhaps in admiration for the strength of the small girl he had almost been ordered to drag away. At last, Marcus took his daughter's hand and turned toward the doors. The crowd parted for them, their eyes following as father and daughter walked side by side, Alyssa still holding her savings close, but her step lighter now, her head higher. When the glass doors opened, the sunlight poured in, wrapping them in warmth, a sharp contrast to the cold humiliation that had filled the lobby before. Together, they walked out, leaving behind a space forever marked by what had happened within it. For those who remained, the message was clear and unforgettable. Dignity cannot be mocked out of existence. Truth cannot be buried under cruelty, and justice, when demanded, can rise even in the most unlikely places. The end. If this story struck a chord with you, don't just let it end here. Show your support by giving this video a like and subscribing so you can hear more powerful stories like this one. I'd love to know what you think of the plot. Was there a moment that hit you harder than the rest? Was it Alyssa's whisper of defiance, or the moment Richard was dragged out in front of everyone? Tell me where you're watching from too. Your perspective adds so much to the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about what true justice looks like when dignity is on the line.